So welcome to the third installment of our webinar series, Islamic Socialism in the Global South, today with a focus on Indonesia and Iran. My name is Wolfgang Fuchs. I'm a lecturer in Islamic and Middle East Studies at the University of Freiburg, and together with my colleague Layli Uddin, we have organized this series. It's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. Oliver Crawford will go first. He's a research fellow at the Leiden International Institute for Asian Studies. His PhD, or he completed his PhD at Trinity College, Cambridge in 2019. And this was a study of the writings of the Indonesian revolutionary and Marxist philosopher Tan Malaka. His current research is focused on the translation of political texts and concepts from Western languages into Malay and Indonesia. And our second speaker who will go after Oliver is Siavash Saffari, currently an associate professor of West Asian Studies at Seoul National University. He received his PhD from the University of Alberta in 2013 and this was followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at Columbia University. And among his many publications, I would like to point out in particular his 2017 monograph, Beyond Shariati, Modernity, Cosmopolitanism, and Islam in Iranian Political Thought, that also was the co-recipient of the 2018 Foundations of Political Theory First Book Award from the American Political Science Association. So it's great that you are here, and we are very much looking forward to your presentations and the discussion.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you to Simon and Layli for organizing this conference and for all of you for attending. My presentation today will be on the translation of socialist ideas into Islamic terms in colonial Indonesia in the late 1910s, early 1920s. And this is a topic I became interested in over the course of my research in Tan Malaka, who was a major figure in the Indonesian anti-colonial movement in these years. And I suppose what I wanted to understand was to see this merging of Islam and socialism, which we have in this period, not just as a kind of cynical political maneuvering to gain mutual support on both sides, but as a genuine attempt to reconcile two sets of ideas. So I hope this would be of interest, not just to people who are interested in Indonesian history, but also those studying Islamic socialism in other parts of the world. And I should say that while this does draw on my research on Tan Malaka, I'll also be using the works of other historians, notably Ruth McVeigh, Takeshi Shireishi, and Kevin Fogg. So the structure of the talk, I'll begin by giving a brief background on Islam and socialism in Indonesia in the early 20th century. I'll then give some examples of the synthesis of socialism and Islam in the 1910s and 1920s, and then talk about some points of tension, some points of conflict that emerge in this period. So just to give a quick background, in the early 20th century in Indonesia, then officially the Dutch East Indies, the population was around 90% made up of Muslims. But politically, the country was dominated by the Dutch ruling elite, who came from the much smaller European segment of the population, which is less than half of 1%. So we have a polarization between a non-Muslim ruling class and an overwhelmingly Muslim population. And there's a similar polarization in the economy, where most of the large firms, especially in the export sector, sugar, tobacco, increasingly oil and rubber, are dominated by Europeans and some Americans, whereas the people who work in these industries, the planters, the laborers, the coolies, the people who rent their lands to the plantations, come mainly from the Muslim majority. So these, I think, are important structural conditions for why an Islamic socialism emerges in the early 20th century, precisely because the ownership of capital is mainly in the hands of non-Muslims, while the laboring classes are largely Islamic. Now, given these polarizations, we find an extended history of anti-colonial rebellions being organized under the banner of Islam in Indonesia. One example is the revolt in Banten in West Java in the late 19th century. And in the early 20th century, as Islamic revivalist movements are gathering steam in the Middle East, some of this energy is being transferred to Indonesia, partially by returning students and pilgrims from the Middle East. And the largest early mass movement to challenge the colonial government is an Islamic movement, the Syarikat Islam, the Islamic Association, which evolves out of a group of traders in central Java, but develops into a huge mass movement. By 1919, it has over 2 million members, making it by far the biggest mass movement of the late colonial period. And in 1917, it calls for self-government. And yes, as I say, it becomes a truly mass movement made up of these peasants and workers who are overwhelmingly Muslim in Indonesia. Okay, so just to give you an idea of who we'll be talking about, this is a picture of an early Syarikat Islam meeting from around 1914. You can see the delegates respectably dressed, a mixture of the Western style and the Javanese style. And the person seated here is Cokro Aminoto, who is the first chair of the Syarikat Islam, a great charismatic orator who helps build the mass support of the organization, turn it into a mass organization, and who is himself very interested in Islamic socialism. Okay, so running parallel to this development of the Syarikat Islam, we have a socialist movement developing in Indonesia. The Indies Social Democratic Association is the first socialist organization started in the Indies. It's formed in 1914. It has around 60 members, almost all of whom are Dutch, many involved in socialist organizations in the Netherlands and in trade unionism. And these are socialists of various descriptions. There are Marxists, social democrats, trade unionists, but they speak Dutch to one another. Some of them don't speak Indonesian languages. Their journals are in Dutch, but they're involved with this emerging trade unionist movement. There are trade unions being begun for postal workers, pawn shop workers, sugar factory workers, workers in the oil industry. And these are linked to these Dutch trade unionists. And under the leadership of Henk Sneevliet, who's the first chair of the ISDV, this social democratic organization, from 1914 until 1919, he works with the Syarikat Islam. So he wants to get the ISDV out of this very European bubble and connect with the Indonesian masses. And Syarikat Islam, this vast, fast-growing movement, he sees as the ideal way of doing this. So he encourages members of the Syarikat Islam to join the ISDV. And in this way, Indonesian Muslims are exposed increasingly to these European socialist traditions. Okay, so how does this Islamic socialism, which is developing, get articulated? Well, one important argument is to see socialist solidarity, the kind of solidarity envisioned in a socialist society, an equal and cohesive society, as linked to this idea of the bonds within Islam. So seeing Islam as a unifying force which complements the unifying rhetoric and ideology of socialism. So Hassan Ali Surati, who's a delegate at the Syarikat Islam Congress in 1916, makes a speech where he says the Prophet is the father of socialism and the trailblazer of democracy. Islam is the corner of building solidarity in socialism. So here we have the idea that Islam is really essential if you're going to build socialism in an in the Indonesian context, precisely because it is this unifying force. And Surati in his speech mentions an Indian socialist called Moshir Hossain Kidwai, who'd written a book on Islam and socialism in 1912, which had reached Indonesia and was quite popular in Syarikat Islam circles. And this book had argued that socialism in terms of its ethics of equality and brotherhood, really could be based on Islamic principles and worked best by being articulated through Islam. So if on the one hand they see Islam as a form of socialist brotherhood, the inverse of that is that capitalism is associated with rather base, impious impulses. And we have frequent references to capitalism as a version of nafsu kekayaan, the lust for wealth, or the lust for profits. That is, it stems from impure motives. So Semaun, who's a prominent leader in the Syarikat Islam, also involved with the Socialists and later the Communists, and is a trade union leader himself, writes this book, Penuntun Kaum Buruh, a guide for the workers in 1920, where he talks about the lust of European merchants. That's what brought them to the Indies, this lust for profits and riches. And that's what made the Dutch colonize Indonesia. So here we have a link, a chain of immoral behaviors, a lust for wealth being linked to capitalism, and capitalism in turn driving colonialism. And it's not just the capitalists who are seen as acting impurely and against Islam on these arguments. There is also the argument that the proletarians, the people who are oppressed by the capitalists, are drawn into sinful behaviors. The argument here, which is made repeatedly in these Syarikat Islam publications and by members of the Syarikat Islam, is that workers who earn wages are too poor to sustain themselves, so they steal to maintain their livelihoods, or they become so desperate that they gamble, drink, take opium, or turn to prostitution. And these are the so-called Mat-Lima, the 5 M's, all sinful behaviors forbidden under Islamic morality. Sultan Malacca is quite typical here when he says gambling, adultery, and all the sins of man are encouraged among the workers. He's talking specifically about plantation laborers here. This is the purest form of capitalism. So we have capitalism here being critiqued through an idiom of an Islamic morality. So given that capitalism sustains these sinful behaviors and stems from impious, impure motives of greed, there is this condemnation of capitalism as sinful, capitalisme yang berdosa, at the 1917 Syarikat Islam Congress. The Congress resolves to condemn capitalism as sinful, which I think reflects the fact that by 1917 it's become very much a movement of the workers and is expressing the discontent of those workers with conditions in their industries, most notably the sugar industry, which is very important in Java. But there's a debate as to whether it's just this Western plantation capitalism that's sinful, or whether in fact all capitalism is sinful. And people on the left of the Syarikat Islam, like Semaun, are arguing that in fact, even if a business, a capitalist enterprise is run by Muslims, it may nonetheless be sinful because it entails the oppression of workers. It stems from greed and other such motivations. That is, they want to oppose the bourgeoisie, this is their language, in all of its forms, not just a Western imperialist bourgeoisie. But then there are people like Chokro Amenoto, or the merchants involved with the Syarikat Islam coming from the Islamic middle class in Indonesia, who, while they condemn this Western imperialist capitalism, nonetheless see room for Muslim-run indigenous enterprises. Okay, so the inverse of sinful capitalism is this idea of Islamic charity, a contrast of capitalist greed and selfishness with Islamic communitarianism. And here we see many arguments, many publications referring to zakat, the duty of Muslims to give alms. And I've taken here a quotation from Islam Bergerak, which is a left-wing Islamic publication, the inspiration of the modern publication we heard about yesterday by the same name. And here we have a condemnation of capitalism as seeing the interests of individuals placed above those of the people, whereas Muslims understand their duty of zakat, the welfare of humanity as a whole, rather than just this materialist focus on wealth. Okay, so taking the argument one step further then, are certain figures within the Sharikat Islam who argue that not only is capitalism sinful, but resisting capitalism is a pious form of conduct. And here they're overturning a view encouraged by the Dutch, but also certain Islamic organizations in Indonesia, that Islam should be apolitical, it should focus on individual, private, religious improvement, rather than politics. But Semaun, who's a leader in this left-wing Sharikat Islam, is promulgating the opposite view, that it's incumbent on Muslims to resist capitalism. And again, in this book, Penuntun Kamburu, he says that trade unionists shouldn't expect worldly things, but the blessings of Allah are the rewards that they should seek. So here we have socialism posed as a form of piety and self-sacrifice. And Tan Malaka makes similar arguments about how communism is the inheritor of this tradition of Islamic struggle. And the most extreme version of this argument is to say that anti-capitalist struggle is a form of holy war to be waged by Muslims against non-Muslim capitalists. This is an argument being made elsewhere as well. It's made by Zinoviev in 1920 at the First Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku, where he calls for a holy war against capitalist imperialism. And Tan Malaka makes a similar argument in Moscow in 1922. And you can see from the quotation here, where he's invoking this pan-Islamic imagery about the crescent and the star of the communists as a means of mobilizing Muslims against their oppression by capitalists, a merging of this pan-Islamic and socialist rhetoric. Okay, so those are points of synthesis. There are also points of tension here, and these really come to a head at the 1921 Sharikat Islam Congress, where Haji Agus Salim, who's the deputy of Chokro Aminoto, argues that Sharikat Islam needs to be a cross-class organization. Therefore, it must reject this notion of class struggle, which will divide Muslims against one another and align them with non-Islamic proletarians in other parts of the world. In his view, solidarity should be based on Islamic solidarity, and this divisive rhetoric of class struggle is un-Islamic. But Semaun and others within the left Sharikat Islam argue that Marxist ideas of class struggle are really essential if any headway is going to be made against colonialism and against capitalism. So not only do they emphasize their Islamic identities and ideologies, but they see themselves very much within this global proletarian movement. They print Marxist materials in their newspapers, these left Sharikat Islam newspapers, and they talk about unifying the proletariat of the world. But this creates a secondary problem, which is that if the left Sharikat Islam are happy to invoke Marx and Engels, that means they're relying on this European, non-Islamic philosophical tradition to supply their political doctrines. And again, Salim rejects this and says, well, all the useful ideas of Marxism, these ideas of solidarity and equality, are already contained within Islamic teachings and Islamic history. And this is fleshed out by Chokro Aminoto in his 1924 book, Islam dan Socialisme, Islam and Socialism, where he draws very heavily on Kidwai, the Indian Islamic socialist I mentioned earlier, to make precisely this argument, that all the positive teachings of socialism are already contained within Islamic teachings. And Marxist materialism needs to be rejected as an alien doctrine, which is not really useful or suitable for the Indonesian context. But Semaun and Tan Malaka are keen to retain these Marxist ideas, which they see as useful tools for combating colonialism and imperialism, in fact, as essential theoretical underpinnings for such resistance. In their view, and Tan Malaka states this explicitly, to have a purely Islamic rebellion would fail, like the Banten revolts had failed, like earlier anti-colonial revolts had failed. So you need to have these theoretical underpinnings in order to succeed. Okay, so just to wrap things up, there is a formal split between the Sarekat Islam and the Indonesian Communist Party, which is the successor of the Social Democratic Organization that I mentioned earlier. That comes in 1921 and branches split into red and white factions. But these Islamic socialist currents continue in Indonesian political thought. And they continue in the communist side as well as on the non-communist side. They animate the anti-colonial rebellion in 1926, and they remain an important prop of mainstream Indonesian anti-colonial nationalism, of Sukarno, the Sukarnoist variety in the 1920s and 30s, but also of Islamic parties in that period and after the war. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for this great presentation, and it really built nicely on some of the aspects that we discussed yesterday. And so now I would like to give the floor to Siavash, who will take us into territory that we haven't covered at all so far, namely Iran. Thank you, Siavash. And I will share my screen as we agreed. Sorry. I think I now just have to go back to your first slide. Sorry, I'm spoiling your presentation a little bit. I hope you don't mind. Okay.
Well, hello, everyone. Salam. It's great to be with all of you. Let me start by thanking Layli and Simon for organizing this webinar and for giving all of us here a very precious opportunity to reflect collectively and critically on these traditions of resistance against capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism in Muslim context. And of course, I'm very grateful to Layli and Simon for including me in this conversation. I would have been happy to be an audience member, but I'm grateful to have this opportunity. And I hope that we can continue this conversation or these conversations in the months and years to come. I'm talking about Iran, of course, in my presentation, and I'm going to share with you some thoughts, some reflections, some findings based on my previous research, but also based on my ongoing research project. But before I get to that, let me first acknowledge that just a few weeks ago, we marked the 32nd anniversary of the 1988 massacres in Iran, the mass execution of thousands of leftist political prisoners, many of them members of the Islamic Socialist, People's Mujahideen organization, but also other political prisoners who belong to secular socialist organizations, members of the Fadayan Khalq, members of the Communist Tudeh Party, members of the Kurdish Democratic Party, and others. 32 years after this massacre, we still don't know the exact number of the victims. Our best estimates are around 5,000. What we do know is that these executions, this massacre took place within the span of a few short weeks in August of 1988, with a direct fatwa from Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, in which Ayatollah Khomeini ordered the execution of any prisoners who were deemed to be muharib, or enemies of God. Now, the 1988 massacre is a reminder, or at least to me, that when we talk about Islamic socialism, or when we talk about the relationship between Islam and socialism, our conversation inevitably intersects with all kinds of other political, historical, social, geopolitical factors. So when we're talking about socialism, a fairly recent phenomenon in Islamic context, including in Iran, we cannot separate this phenomenon from the broader historical conditions of the expansion of global capitalism, or of European colonial modernity into Islamic context. Or when we talk about the decline of socialism, the decline of Islamic socialism in Iran, in Egypt, in Indonesia, near the end of the 20th century, we can't separate this decline from the geopolitical realities of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of American global hegemony, or along the same vein of thinking when we consider the male-dominated and masculine history of Islamic socialism, or of secular socialism for that matter. We simply can't separate these histories, these masculine histories, from the global and local histories of patriarchy. So I'm trying to see these linkages and these connections between the local and the global. And it's from this particular vantage point that I look at the history of Islamic socialism. And when Layli and Simon kindly invited me to this conference, I proposed to discuss the transnational genealogy of Islamic socialism in Iran. Now, I hope that when the dust of this awful COVID pandemic settles, we can still meet in person, we can still have our conference, and at that conference, I would be happy to give you a full account of the transnational genealogy of Islamic socialism in Iran. But for now, for the purpose of this brief presentation, I want to do a couple of things. First, I want to say a few words about the history of socialism in Iran. And then very briefly, I want to distinguish between 4 approaches to Islam and socialism in the hope that distinguishing between these 4 approaches can help us in thinking about the relationship between Islam and socialism in other contexts also. Now, since Simon has my PowerPoint slides, if you can please go to the next slide.
So I'm just trying to do this. Give me, yeah.
The arrival of socialism in Iran goes back to the late 19th century, early 20th century. So some of the same historical period that was just being covered in the context of Indonesia. In fact, the first socialist organizations began to appear in major Iranian cities, in Tehran and Mashhad, right around the same time of the constitutional revolution of 1905. And by far, the biggest and most popular of these organizations was Firqe Ijtemaiyun Ammiyun, or the Social Democratic Party of Persia. You can see their emblem on the slide. So underneath, you see it says Firqe Ijtemaiyun Ammiyun Iran, the Social Democratic Party of Iran. On the right, on the flag, it says Hurriyat, freedom. On the left flag, it says Musavat, equality. And then at the very top, it says Edalat, or justice. And then in between the 2 flagpoles, we see the word Mujahid, because initially when the Social Democratic Party of Iran opened its offices in Iran, including in Mashhad, perhaps and partly to counter the rumors that these are a bunch of God-denying atheists, communists, they would also call themselves Mujahideen Islam. Ijtemaiyun Ammiyun Mujahideen Islam, the Islamic Mujahideen, Social Democrats, the Islamic Mujahideen. So the Social Democratic Party was the first socialist, or at least social democratic party, which was established inside Iran. But several years before this, Iranian immigrants in the Caucasus had already been exposed to European socialism and Russian socialist traditions. Some of these immigrants had joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. Others had joined the prominent Muslim social democratic organizations that existed in Baku, Azerbaijan at the time, including the Hummat Party and the Adalat Party. When the constitutional revolution begins in Iran, many of these immigrants return to Iran and they establish the first socialist and social democratic organizations inside the country. And so from the time of the constitutional revolution of 1905 until the 1979 revolution, socialism, including both secular socialism and Islamic socialism, remains an important social and political force in Iran, with ups and downs, of course, with successes and failures. And when we get to the 1979 revolution, we see that various socialist currents and actors are playing a role, from the Marxist-Leninist Fadai guerrillas to Muslim socialists, including Ali Shariati, whom I will briefly talk about, the Mujahideen Khalq, and several other figures and groups. But then, of course, as I noted earlier, by the time we get to the early 1980s, the post-revolutionary Islamic Republic launches a campaign of suppressing and silencing the left through these executions, arrests, censorship, and so on and so forth. And it seems the Iranian left has never really recovered from this suppression, even though there have been sporadic efforts in the country continuing today to keep both secular socialism and religious socialism alive. Can we please see the next slide? Now, when we look at the history of socialism in Iran over the past nearly 120 years, I think it's possible to make a distinction between two broad orientations, currents, among Iranian socialists. There's a secular orientation and a religious orientation. And each of these orientations can then be divided into two sub-orientations. On the secular side, it's possible to distinguish between those secular socialists who have a negative or even dismissive, combative take on religion, who see religion as the opiate of the masses based on what I consider to be a simplistic understanding or reading of Karl Marx. And I call these skeptical secular socialists. And on the other side, we have those socialists, those secular socialists who have a more positive or accommodating position on religion, and who think that religion can play a progressive or emancipatory role in social and political struggles. And I call these optimistic secular socialists. On the religious side too, we can distinguish between what I call Islamic socialists or non-clerical Islamic socialists on the one hand, and on the other hand, clerical Islamist socialists. Islamic socialists, or the non-clerical Muslim socialists, are those Muslims who see Islam and socialism as being compatible. They draw on the mobilizational and inspirational capacities of religion, of Islam, in order to establish a socialist or social democratic political and economic order. Islamist socialists, or clerical Islamist socialists, to be more specific, also believe that Islam and socialism can be compatible, but they set themselves apart from the previous group by placing the notion of an Islamic state at the very center of their social and political agenda. In other words, for Islamists, for Islamist socialists, socialist economics are best served under an Islamic state that also implements some version, some variation of Islamic law. This is different from Islamic socialism, from non-clerical Islamic socialism, which uses the capacities of religion to achieve socialism, but doesn't want to create an Islamic state based on Sharia law. Now, of course, as you all know very well, in Iran, in the context of Shiism, in the context of Twelver Shiism specifically, the notion of an Islamic state is closely tied to clerical and jurisprudential authority. Because if the Islamic state is a state set up by the Islamic vanguard, to use the term that Sayyid Qutb uses, if it's a state set up by the Islamic vanguard, and if the objective of an Islamic state is to implement Islamic law, then in the Twelver Shi'i context, it's the Shi'i ulama, the clergy, that claims to be the true Islamic vanguard, the guardians of the Islamic faith, the interpreters, and also the implementers of Islamic law. And for this reason, I think there's an important difference here to be made between Islamic socialism, which takes a more or less secular approach to the question of the state, and Islamist socialism, which defends an Islamic state based on clerical and jurisprudential authority. Let me give you an example from each orientation very quickly so that it becomes a little more tangible exactly what it is that I'm talking about. And here, if I may ask Simon to please bring the next slide. Now, here's Bijan Jazani. Jazani is a good example of a skeptical, secular socialist. Jazani was one of the founders of the Fedai guerrillas, a Marxist-Leninist group that was created in the 1960s to fight against the monarchy. For Jazani, religion, all religions, including Islam, represent a form of false consciousness, a force of backwardness. And he thought that one of the responsibilities of a truly socialist state after the revolution, after a socialist revolution takes place, once we have a socialist state, one of the responsibilities of that state would be to fight against religious false consciousness. And you can see that clearly in this quote where he says, religion is a superstructural remnant of a bygone era. It shall be systematically uprooted from society, albeit through peaceful means. The Shi'i clerical establishment, like all other religious establishments, has been on the side of and a servant to the ruling regimes and has utilized religion to exploit and oppress workers and the marginalized masses. Can we move to the next slide, please? On the other hand, we have someone like Khosrow Gole-Sorkhi, another Marxist-Leninist, a poet, an intellectual who was also opposed to the monarchy, but who, compared to Jazani, has a much more optimistic view on religion and on Islam. Gole-Sorkhi is best known for his 1974 trial, during which he gave a very fiery and impassioned defense, and famously said, as a Marxist-Leninist, I begin my talk by recalling Hussein ibn Ali, Imam Hussein, the great martyr of the people of the Middle East. The real Islam has always played a part in liberation movements. When Karl Marx says, in a class-based society, wealth and hunger are the two sides of the same coin, and when Ali ibn Abi Talib says, no castle is built without making thousands of people poor and homeless, we cannot deny that there are great similarities here. Sadly, both Jazani and Gole-Sorkhi were executed by the monarchy and did not live to see the 1979 revolution and the coming to power of the Islamic Republic. Can we please go to the next slide? Now, here we have Ali Shariati. When it comes to non-clerical Islamic socialism, I think Shariati is by far the most prominent figure. He defended socialism, of course, and thought it was perfectly compatible with Islam, but he opposed the idea of a religious state. And he seemed to favor some type of a social democratic political order. And you see on socialism, we have Shariati here saying democracy and socialism are the most progressive ideologies of the modern world, which contain within them the legacies of all historical struggles for freedom and equality throughout our shared human history. And when it comes to the clergy and the notion of a religious state, here we see Shariati's skeptical take. What is a religious state? It's a regime in which those with religious authority, rather than those with political expertise, occupy power at the state and government level. In other words, a religious state is a regime that imposes clerical rule upon the nation. Among the natural outcomes of this regime is tyranny. A religious state is the mother of all tyrannies because in it, the ruler sees himself as the shadow and representative of God on earth, regards his own will to be the will of God, and thus commits every injustice and every abuse without the slightest hesitation. Can we move to the next slide, please? Now, finally, we get to this clerical, what I call clerical Islamist socialism in Iran. And here I think Ayatollah Murtaza Motahari is a good representative, especially Motahari's ideas near the end of his life. In his later works, Motahari talked about egalitarian and socialist-like economic measures. He defended something that he called ethical or moral socialism. But unlike Shariati, who opposed the idea of a religious state, Motahari defended the idea of an Islamic state and the implementation of Sharia law. And he was a staunch supporter, of course, of Ayatollah Khomeini's theory of velayat al-faqih, jurisprudential guardianship. And you can see his views here in these quotes on socialism. He says, today, alongside communism and capitalism, a third orientation is emerging, which may be considered as a type of socialism. This new orientation accepts some measure of private ownership and doesn't equate ownership with exploitation. He goes on to argue that Islam actually defends some type of ownership, but because Islam is also an egalitarian religion, it combines both ownership and egalitarianism. And then he says this orientation, which is regarded in the West as ethical socialism, is precisely what Islam has always sought to fulfill. But then when it comes to the clergy and religious state, here you see a very different take from Shariati's take. He says, today our movement is following the early Islamic example by going after governance structures. Today, the key notion of our clerical movement is that of the Islamic state, whereas previously this objective was either neglected or it was expressed only implicitly. Only the Shi'i clergy can lead our movement because the clergy has thrived in an Islamic culture and is thoroughly familiar with the Quran, Islamic studies, tradition, and jurisprudence. Now, it's very interesting that in contemporary Iran, even though Motahari is usually praised as one of the heroes of the revolution, his final writings, including one of his books on economics, on Islamic economics, in which he argues for some form of Islamic socialism, these latest writings are actually banned in Iran and have been banned for nearly 3 decades because they're seen as being controversial and even being un-Islamic. Now, before I end, Simon, can I ask you to please go back to the slide with the graph on it with the 4 categories of Islamic socialism? Thank you. So here, just to remind you of these 4 categories, I wanted them on this slide, but I also want to acknowledge that these 4 categories that I'm introducing in this presentation are both incomplete and also somewhat simplistic. For one thing, the line between these categories is not always as clear as I presented them here. For example, some of you and some people might disagree that there is a meaningful difference between Islamic and Islamist socialism. I think the difference is real, but I do acknowledge that there are major overlaps. Aside from this, in my presentation, I didn't differentiate between anti-clerical and anti-religious views. This is an important distinction that needs to be addressed on its own merit, maybe in some other occasion. Thirdly, in this presentation, whenever I said religious socialism, when I said in Iran there's both religious socialism and secular socialism, I was talking about people who subscribe to the Islamic faith. We know that even though Iran is a predominantly Muslim country, there are several religious minority groups, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Baha'is, and so on and so forth. And members of these communities too have played a role in the making of Iranian socialism. And their presence and their contributions shouldn't be dismissed or erased. But as I said, because of the short nature of this presentation, not something that I got a chance to discuss. And finally, I only introduced and discussed the men who have played a role in the history of socialism and Islamic socialism in Iran. This is a major weakness of my work, and it's something that I hope to address and to remedy in my future work as this project continues. I'll end my comments here. Thank you for patiently listening to me, and I look forward to your comments, questions, and criticisms.
Great. Thank you, Siavash and Oliver, for what a wonderful presentation. Before we take questions from the audience, itself. I think both me and Simon have a question each for sort of for you. Well, question for you both. With Oliver, I was just wondering, when it comes to the left in Shariat Islam, what is the imagination around what a post-capitalist society would look like? How are they talking? What is the conversation around land, labor, and ownership? I mean, and how, I mean, are they going back to a pre-colonial age or to older sort of Islamic histories, or is there a new future that's being crafted here by Shariat Islam? If you could answer to that. With Siavash, I was actually going to ask about the women, but since you, but I'll move on to, I mean, I was wondering if you could talk about something about some of the women and their sort of involvement in sort of the history of Islamic socialism in Iran. But shall I just leave it there if you have something to say about that? And then I'll sort of, Simon, I'll hand it over to you.
I think you can answer first and then I come in with my question.
Sure.
Okay, I'm happy to go first. Yes, well, thank you. That's yes, an important issue about this post-capitalist future that starts to be imagined in the 1910s. I would say there are two views that emerge that are somewhat in tension with one another. One is that Indonesians need to return to this pre-colonial regime of communal land ownership, which is to some extent still in place in large parts of Indonesia, and that it's this communal world of the village that has avoided these problems of the modern capitalist economy, right? Everyone has sufficient goods to supply their needs because everyone has access to land, and the produce is distributed equally across the people. And so we have an invocation of Javanese traditions of mutual help. And indeed invocations of, this is portrayed as a good religious Islamic community because it's in such context where people maintain the Islamic faith, which has been eroded in this capitalist wage labor economy, where people are drawn into sin. But on the other hand, you do have people arguing for a modernization of the economy, right? The nationalization of these Western industries, Western-owned industries, and a development of them through centralized planning. And the desire to foster an Indonesian entrepreneurial class, an Islamic entrepreneurial class. So these two things are in tension, and I don't think it's ever quite worked out because the idealization of the village suggests a very decentralized kind of economy and an agrarian economy, whereas this modernization project implies central planning and indeed industrial and urban development. So you have people arguing both sides of the case.
Great, thank you. Oliver, Siavash.
Thanks. Thank you for your question, Layli, and giving me a chance to acknowledge my own weakness again and then try to address it as I'm thinking through this question with you. I mean, okay, so again, let me just reiterate that part of this is my own weakness. I need to do much more archival work to go back and take out, look at the pamphlets that were being printed in various phases. Look at who are the women who are involved in these groups. Another part of my weakness and limitation is that my work is mostly intellectual history. And I'm mostly working with these famous intellectual men. So I try to remedy that by, I hopefully will try to remedy that by finding, maybe lesser known authors who may be women. But so that's my issue and my weakness. Now, there's also the issue of a masculine history. Of course, we do have a male-dominant history in Iran, in modern Iran, as we do in other parts of the world. It is a masculine history, including the history of socialism. Now, in all of the orientations that I mentioned, we can certainly find women. We can certainly find women. So, for example, one woman who came to my mind was Maryam Firuz, who was one of the leading figures of the Tudeh party around the time of the 1979 revolution. And Maryam Firuz could be considered one of those that we call a optimistic secular socialist. She's somebody who is an atheist herself and does not shy away from admitting that she's an atheist. At the same time, she was sort of saw that religion, or thought that religion could play an emancipatory role. And in fact, like the rest of the Tudeh party, and this is probably one of their biggest mistakes, they famously defended Ayatollah Khomeini and backed him both before the revolution and for a couple of years after the revolution. But very sadly and tragically, Maryam Firuz herself ended up in prison a few years after the revolution, despite the fact that she had passionately defended Ayatollah Khomeini. So Maryam Firuz is someone that could be acknowledged here. Now, when we look at this Islamic socialist or Muslim socialist, for example, when we think of the Mujahideen organization, the Mujahideen Khalq, People's Mujahideen, both before and after the revolution, we know that there were many women who were members of the Mujahideen, including who were guerrilla fighters. But in the leadership, this is not reflected quite often. Of course, Mujahideen, after the revolution, their fate changed completely, and now they've become a completely different group based in Europe. Their current leader is Maryam Rajavi, a woman, but I'm talking about the original Mujahideen Khalq, who had many women in their among their members, but not in their leadership. When we look at other Islamic socialist organizations, so before Mujahideen, for example, there was the Khodaparastan Socialist, God-worshipping socialists. Also, as far as I know, an all-male group, or at least at the leadership level. Now, another way to think about this is to ask or to think about how perhaps Iranian socialists, the men that I'm looking at, how they have looked at the question of women, gender equality, and rights and status of women. And here, I think, for example, if we look at Shariati is famous for, among other works, Fatima is Fatima, right? Fatimas, his book on Fatima. And in several lectures and writings, Shariati addresses the quote-unquote question of women. Now, of course, there are serious feminist critiques of Shariati's views on women, and I partially am sympathetic to some of these critiques. Now, I think the future, and I'm an eternal optimist, I think the future is much brighter. I have written in the past about the neo-Shariati movement in Iran. And when we look at the neo-Shariatis, these followers of Shariati in contemporary Iran, there are many of them who are women, prominent women, university professors, journalists, leaders of women's rights activist groups. And so I'm going to go on a limb here and say the future is going to be much brighter and much less masculine, hopefully.
Great.
Thank you, Siavash. I also have a question for the two of you, which has to do with how these Islamic socialists engage with the Islamic scholarly tradition. I was struck by the discussion we had on Monday and on Tuesday, yesterday and the day before, on the context of Turkey and Indonesia. On the one hand, I felt for many Islamic socialists, they mainly try to work with the Quran and with Quranic principles and trying either to go around the sort of tradition of fiqh and other parts of the Islamic scholarly tradition in order to find material to work with, or as we heard yesterday in the context of Indonesia, there's also some criticism of that people just extract certain principles. Gus Fayyadel yesterday said that he also takes issue with people who would say, even already the Prophet Muhammad was engaged in class struggle because he finds it simplistic, but still his major material is sort of the Quran. In the context of, and I was just wondering whether we can whether there is a difference between sort of Shi'i and Sunni approaches to Islamic socialism in this regard, that Shi'i figures would be more interested in drawing on also, the experiences of the imams, for example. This just came to mind when you, Siavash, also, of course, you quoted a Marxist who is precisely not an Islamist or a supporter of Islamic socialism, but even Gol Sohi was sort of trying to make the case that he's following the path of Imam Hussein and of Imam Ali. And I was just wondering whether you see this also, Oliver, in your reading of these resources, whether you see in a Sunni context more an engagement with the Quran, or whether there are also other figures, tafsir, fiqh comes in, and whether we can see any difference here in this regard between Sunnis and Shi'is.
Oliver, if you don't mind, do you mind if I start? Yeah. Well, okay, so what came to my mind when you asked the question, Simon, is in terms of engagement with the Islamic tradition. And I think it's a fascinating question and something important to think about. And this is, on Monday, I tried to bring this up with Ihsan too. How do Muslims and Muslim theologians understand socialism, right? And of course, there's a very common tendency, and I think it was very interesting, and it became pretty obvious too in Oliver's presentation. There is this tendency, especially among the first generation of Muslim socialists, to write, to make these claims about how Muhammad was the first socialist in the world, or Ali was the first socialist in the world, or that socialism, somehow this claim that socialism actually began with Islam, right? And that was one way that they were trying to make reconcile Islam with socialism. And I think in Iran too, and in the Shi'i context too, we see some of that. Now, in terms of is there a particular difference between Shi'i and Sunni? What I thought is that at least with Shariati, and perhaps this contributes to why Shariati is popular in Sunni context as well. When it comes to Shariati really, even though he has books on Shi'ism, and one of his books being Shi'ism, the Complete Party, he tries to avoid this binary of Shi'i Sunni. He tries to avoid the binary that Shi'ism really contains the socialist core of Islam. He tries to identify, he thinks that there is a socialist core in Islam, and he tries to identify this socialist core in both Sunni tradition and Shi'i tradition, and he tries to identify figures that are celebrated by Sunnis and Shi'is as well. For example, Shariati's first published work was the translation from Arabic to Farsi of a book by an Egyptian author on Abu Dhar al-Ghifari, right? One of the disciples of Prophet Muhammad, or Abu Zar, as we say in Farsi. And the book, Shariati translated the book as a fairly accurate translation, actually, Abu Zar, the first socialist in history. So again, that tendency of identifying Abu Zar, someone who's celebrated by Sunnis, and saying, well, here is an example of a Muslim socialist in the Sunni tradition. And then in other works, he talks about Imam Ali, of course, a celebrated figure for both Sunnis and Shias, Imam Ali as being a Muslim socialist. So there's some of that happening. But then, because you also mentioned jurisprudence, I think Shariati does something which is far more interesting to me than these claims about Muhammad or Abu Zar being the first socialist in history. He does something far more interesting in one of his last works, which is called Class Orientation in Islam. He actually goes through the Quran, and he goes through the jurisprudential tradition in Shi'ism specifically. And he says, Shi'i jurisprudential tradition is all bourgeois economics. It's all capitalism. It's all defending property. And he calls for a radical restructuring of the entire Shi'i jurisprudence. And he calls for what he calls liberation fiqh, liberation jurisprudence. Not only do we need a liberation theology, we specifically need to go back and engage with the jurisprudential tradition, read it from a socialist perspective, and critique the capitalist dominant tendencies or profit dominant tendencies within traditional fiqh.
Okay, so yes, thanks for the question, Simon. So I just preface my remarks by saying very few of these ideas are worked out in lengthy scholarly texts. And I think this is possibly one difference between the Indonesian context and the Iranian context in this period, is that these people are operating under conditions of colonial censorship. So they have to some extent, temper what they're going to say to bear that in mind, but also, that there aren't many printing presses being run by these organizations, resources are limited. So what we tend to find is newspaper articles or perhaps pamphlets, but not really any extended, scholarly works on these subjects. And Tan Malaka is one of the few people who's writing substantial books on these questions. But he's able to do that in part because he's working overseas and having his stuff printed in Manila or Singapore and then smuggled into Indonesia. But I would say in terms of the left Syarikat Islam, there is a tendency to draw on Islamic history, very much in the way that we've just heard described, talking about the early caliphate as a model of a socialist society. And there are some, most notably Haji Misbah, who's an ulama, who's active within the left Syarikat Islam and later in the Indonesian Communist Party, who's writing extended essays in newspapers that are drawing heavily on Quranic sources. He's someone who is well versed in these traditions. In fact, drawing much more on that than on secular sources, whereas someone like Tan Malaka is much more familiar with the works of Marx and Engels than with the Quran, which he'd learned in his youth, but had largely forgotten by the 1920s. But on the right, I think there's not necessarily the right of the Syarikat Islam. Someone like Chokro Aminoto, in his book Islam and Socialism, is drawing on Quranic sources, but he's borrowing almost all of them from Bashir Hussein Kidwai, which to me suggests he's not himself necessarily especially well versed in these texts. He's getting it secondhand from other authorities, whereas, and he's reading that text in English, right? It's not clear that his Arabic is especially good, but he's been to a Western style school. He's reads Dutch, he reads English, so he's accessing some of these Islamic socialist ideas through those European languages. So it's an interesting process of the way these ideas are filtered through multiple sources and multiple languages before they come back around to the Indonesian Islamic context.
Great, thank you. So we already have several questions that people either sent via the chat or when they raise their hand. So the first question that I would like to read out is by Adil Khan, who has a question for Siavash. And the question is, optimistic secular socialists in Islam, do they accept state violence to maintain law and order?
To be honest with you, I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. Optimistic secular socialism and Islam, do they accept violence? We can't hear you.
Wait, I'm gonna get Simon. Yeah.
Sorry, I was still muted. Sorry, I can read out the question again. Optimist secular socialists in Islam, do they accept state violence to maintain law and order? That's the question that we received from Adil Khan.
Well, okay, let me try to think of the relation between optimistic secular socialism and state violence generally. It really depends. I mean, so when I say optimistic, I was only talking about their position on religion, right? So for example, the Tudeh party of Iran, the communist Tudeh party, now they have an interesting history. They began initially with a much more skeptical take on religion. But by the time we get to, so in the 1940s, they're much more skeptical. The Tudehs are much more skeptical of religion. By the time we get to the 1960s, Tudeh becomes much more optimistic on religion. By the time we get to the 70s, Tudeh even becomes pro-Khomeini and pro-clericalism. So in that sense, I call them optimistic. Now, but when it comes to state violence, the Communist Tudeh Party is a Marxist-Leninist party. They are a Sovietist party. In fact, most people see them as a Soviet offshoot in Iran. And yes, to the extent that we can sort of draw any similarities between Tudeh and the Soviet model, of course, I mean, they would endorse state violence in that sense. But I'm not sure if I understood exactly what the questioner meant by that. So I hope that sort of addresses it.
Thanks, Siavash. I think in the interest of time, we will group the next 3 questions. And on my list, Sasha Zajadi, who would come first, and Dr. Ali Mohammed second, and Johan Čeko as the third. And when you raise your question, it would be great if you could quickly introduce yourself, that we have an idea where you are, who you are, sorry. So
Hello.
Sasha Zajadi would be.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. So yeah, my name is Sasha Sajadi. I'm based in Bristol in the UK. And my question was for Siavash. And so with the Iranian Revolution, I think it was, we know that the left in general and socialists played a huge role in the revolution itself, but also the fact that the Islamists in the revolution were heavily inspired by socialism in general. Like a lot of the early propaganda is really worker focused. It was, it's the revolution of Pabirahnagan, those with bare feet. And I think I grew up in a very Islamic revolutionary family. And one of the things that was really drilled into me was like, oh, the hadith from Imam Ali, if you ever see a huge amount of wealth hoarded in one place, you should know that, the rights of others have been taken away for that wealth to be gathered. And what I find really interesting, especially in the context of Iran, is how state propaganda has changed based on the economic trajectory of the country. So we've gone from that basically to basic Jahangiri and Hassan Rouhani going on the 2017 presidential debates and talking about how Imam Ali was a job creator, Imam Jafar Sadiq was really wealthy and there's nothing wrong with that, and sort of preaching this prosperity gospel. I remember being in Iran, I opened a pack of tissues and there was a little leaflet in it talking about how national minimum wage was bad for workers and we should campaign against it with these kinds of hadiths. And so sorry, come back to my question, firstly, how do you see that intellectual sort of position as changing within the state itself? And maybe this is outside of your remit, but why and how do you see, why has that happened, basically? Thank you.
Okay, so Dr. Ali Mohammed would be next in case we've also received his question.
No.
I have, so I can also read it out. So he asks, socialism has non-Islamic origins, but Islamic society needs to adopt terminology which must distinguish it from non-Islamic terminology loaded with the ideology. So this would be his question, or rather comment, I guess. And then the third question we have was also sent in by Johan Čeko, who has a question for Oliver. Does Siavash's 4-way typology for Islam and socialism work for early 20th century Indonesia? These are the 3 questions, and then please go ahead and give your answers.
Oliver, why don't you go first this time?
Okay, all right, thanks. I'll address the last question first. Yes, well, thank you for that typology, which I think is useful for the Indonesian context also. And I would say also useful is the distinction you mentioned towards the end about anti-clericalism and anti-religious stances, because I think you see that very much within the left wing of the Syarikat Islam, that they criticize what they see as conservative religious authorities as sustaining capitalism, but also pre-capitalist social relations that were unequal and unjust in their eyes, but they nonetheless see in Islamic religion the core of an egalitarian and socialist politics. And Tan Malaka, I would say, falls very much into that category. He's critical of, well, sort of open this. I'd be intrigued on the Iranian context for this, because what I find is that with some of these Islamic socialists, they are treating Islam as a generic religion, right? They say, well, look, it functions, and I think we saw this in some of your quotations that you gave. It functions much like Christianity did in medieval Europe, or Hinduism did in pre-colonial India. That is, it sustained highly unequal and unjust social relations. That is, it's one religion among many, which, you know, people like Chukra Aminoto would never articulate those ideas. But yes, I think, you know, to return to the original question, this distinction, this broad distinction, is useful because we do have those arguing for an Islamic state, which might nonetheless be implementing socialist ideas and policies, as against those who believe that religion may help to achieve socialism, but want a separation of religion and the state. So those who are involved in the Social Democratic Association, which becomes the Indonesian Communist Party in 1920, their party program commits them to a separation of religion and government. So in that sense, they must be treated separately to those who campaign for an Islamic state, like as the Masyumi Party does in the 1950s, but would nonetheless describe itself as a socialist party of a kind. But nonetheless, there are figures like who see the early Islamic polity positively, right? So they're not entirely divorced from this idea. They're not seeing secular politics as a unmitigated good, but in terms of their contemporary programs, and this again, I think speaks to an important difference. Tan Malaka says explicitly, well, when we're talking about Islamic history, we're talking about a period very distant in the past generally, and it's just too far away for us to claim useful ideas, political ideas from those periods. Whereas the ideas of socialism are a more modern vintage. They speak to modern society. They speak to industrialization. They speak to capitalism. So that's where we need to locate, that's where we need to draw the bulk of our political programs from. So yes, I would say the distinction is useful. And I would add that we have a difference in terms of seeing Islam as generically or as a unique sort of system, as a unique revelation, and also a distinction between seeing Islamic history as something distant, and I think historical materialism is part of what explains that, right? It's pre-capitalist, it's feudal, or perhaps primitive communist in some accounts, as against seeing it as fresh, right? As something still highly relevant, still contemporary in a sense. So yes, that's what I would say to that.
Sasha, thank you for that question, and for the way that you set it up. That was great. So this idea that, yeah, of course, the idea that Islamism, which was also one of the major forces of the 1979 revolution, and just in the for everybody else who might not be as familiar with the context of Iran, usually and now it's become pretty common for many of us to talk about these various influences in the 1979 revolution, and recognizing that yes, there was even though it's called an Islamic revolution, or at least it became known as the Islamic revolution after the revolution, many of us are trying to highlight these various forces that participated in this revolution, recognizing that Islamism was, of course, one of the major forces of the revolution, and it was the force that, for a variety of reasons, ended up taking over the post-revolutionary state, but also recognizing that the left, whether the religious left or the secular left, was also a major part of the Islamic Revolution. Nationalists, including both secular nationalists and religious nationalists, were a part of the revolution. So just recognizing these different forces and voices. But I think, Sasha, you're right that Islamism in the course of the Iranian Revolution was deeply influenced by socialism, by socialist discourses of social justice. But there is also a sort of a current of historiography of the Iranian Revolution that argues that socialist concepts were appropriated by the Islamists, that these were not authentic to Islamism. And I tend to subscribe to this view, and I've written on this, I've written a few articles on this, including an article on two pro-Mostaz'afin discourses, the discourse of Mostaz'afin or Mostad'afun. There's two different discourses of Mostaz'afin in the Iranian Revolution, and I've tried there to distinguish between an Islamist notion of Mostaz'afin and a liberation theology or more Islamic socialist notion of Mostaz'afin. In any case, I think there is a lot of appropriation taking place. And I'll give you an example just to make it a little more tangible, again, what I'm talking about. I think when we look at Ruhollah Khomeini as the leading Islamist figure of 20th century Iran, we certainly see some level of appropriation of Islamist, of socialist discourses. So when we look at Khomeini's early writings, Khomeini always talks about the poor. I mean, he always has a pro-poor concern, and even in his early writings. But when we compare Khomeini's early writings to his sermons and writings in the immediate period of the revolution, so in 1978, 1979, there's a major shift that takes place. And some people have written about this. Ervand Abrahamian, Asif Fayyad has written about this, and I've tried to also contribute to this idea that in Khomeini's earlier writings, when he talks about the poor, or when he uses the term Mostaz'afin, al-Mustad'afun, he's really talking about them as sort of the meek, the weak, the powerless, the victims, these people who have no agency. And he sort of calls on Muslims, really calling on rich Muslims, to give some charity to the poor and help the poor. He's not addressing the poor directly. He's addressing other Muslims to, help the poor, and he's addressing the government, the monarchy, to improve the condition of the poor. When we get to 1978, 1979, right before the revolution, there's a major shift in Khomeini's approach toward the poor. He starts addressing the poor directly. And the term Mostaz'afin takes on a new meaning in Khomeini's sermons and writings. It becomes not the weak, not the meek, not the defeated, but the angry poor, the poor who have agency. So he constantly talks about how this revolution is a revolution of the Mostaz'afin. These angry poor masses have come to the streets, right? And he, of course, famously promises them that if we establish an Islamic state, you will get free school, free electricity, free everything, right? In that famous talk that he gives after arriving in Tehran at Tehran Cemetery. Now, what we see is that I've argued that in the first decade after the 1979 revolution, the Islamic Republic actually implements some of these, if we don't call them socialist, but at least egalitarian economic measures. And there is evidence to show that there is major reduction of poverty and economic inequality in Iran in the first decade of the revolution. So to some extent, that appropriation isn't just discursive, it also finds a policy implication. But then after the first decade of the revolution, by the time we get to the late 1980s, I've argued that there is a neoliberal shift that takes place in Iran. And gradually, Islamic Republic has moved away from its early pro-poor egalitarian commitments and has become a state representing the Muslim bourgeoisie, but increasingly a smaller and smaller segment of the population. Now, there's various reasons why the first decade was the way it was and the subsequent decades were the way they were. Part of it has to do with the global and geopolitical realities of the end of the Cold War and decline of the left generally. but also because in the first decade of the revolution, some of the Islamist left came to power. So Mir Hossein Mousavi, the prime minister at the time, he belonged to the school of Islamist left. He was a student of Motahari and he was a follower of Shariati. And so in the first decade, we see a lot of these egalitarian policies that have slowly disappeared in Iran over the last 3 decades.
Great. I thank you for taking these questions. We have another round with Chuan, Murshid Alam, and Luke Wilkinson. Next on my list, Chuan, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you so much. My question, first of all, I just want to say thank you for a wonderful presentation from both of you. I really enjoyed it. My question is for Professor Saffari. But before I get into my question, I just wanted to make 2 very quick comments in relation to Layli's question to the both of you, and also Simon's question to the both of you. So one of the, Professor Saffari, you mentioned Abu Zar al-Ghifari, right? I just wanted to sort of bring up that I've noticed Indonesian Islamic socialists bringing him up as well. He is very much a node, a sort of like lodestone for their interest, and they look to him as a exemplar, somebody that they should emulate. I'll leave it at that. This is in the work of people like Yusuf Wibisono. The second thing in relation to Lily's question was the issue of, how do they sort of adapt from the past and what do they identify as institutions or practices or policies worth implementing. The concept of the Beit ul Mal, the sort of public treasury that has many functions, sort of like the state treasury, but also responsible for the disbursement of zakat. That is something that comes up in a lot of Islamic communist discourse as well. And so people like Hassan Rayed actively say, well, we need to figure out what a Beit ul Mal looks like today. We need to figure out how do we implement a Beit ul Mal, in a way that's relevant to society, right? And obviously, I guess what he has in mind is something not very similar to not dissimilar to the welfare state. Okay, I will leave my comments at that. Here's my question. So, like I said, my question is for you, Professor Saffari. And this is really about a transnational genealogy of the Islamic socialist movement in Iran. I'm a scholar of Indonesia, but I find, I trained at Arzu Osanlu at the University of Washington, so I have a sort of side interest in Iran as well. And how would you situate the early iterations of Islamic socialism in Iran? So like, for example, the Socialist Party of Iran that you began your presentation with, or the Jangal movement of Mirza Kujat Khan, right, the Socialist Republic of Gilan, sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Given Iran's sort of geographical proximity to the Soviet Union, are these movements an iteration of Soviet attempts to create sympathetic movements and regimes in Central Asia, the way Ben Fuchs and Bulin Gokey have described? Or are they distant kind of predecessors to Shariati and Motahari? Or are they perhaps sort of like cognates of Islamic socialism in Indonesia, which matured around the same time, so late 1910s, early 1920s, in response to imperial predations, but similar to the ones faced by Iran, right? But also with a significant European genealogical component. So I'm wondering, really what are the similarities and differences between the Indonesian and the Iranian example? And also how does Iran fit, or at least early iterations of Islamic socialism, how does it fit into the, shall we say, Central Asian Soviet model, if that makes sense? Thank you.
And we'll go to Murshid. Murshid, are you there?
Otherwise, okay.
Yeah, hello.
Yes, hi.
Murshid, yeah, hi. Murshid Alam from India. My question is to Oliver. Could you please elaborate on Indian Islamic socialism a bit and its link with the Indonesian one? Thank you.
And Luke Wilkinson would be the last one for this round.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I'm Luke from Malta, but I'm at Cambridge right now. My question is for Siavash as well, I'm afraid. It's basically, so Khomeini frequently stresses the Shiite ideas of good versus evil and a long history of exploitation and oppression when discussing the Shah and American neocolonialism. I was wondering how far this can be called a Shiite particularist understanding of class struggle and historical materialism. Thanks.
Oliver, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer Moshad's question. In terms of the Indian links, as I said, the most important source from India, as far as we can tell, is this author, Bashir Hossain Kidwai, Kidwai, who writes a book called Islam and Socialism in English in 1912. It reaches Indonesia in the 1910s. It's being cited in Syarikat Islam meetings by 1916. And there's a recent article by Kevin Fogg, Fogg, where he discusses the reception of this text and how it likely was diffused through Ahmadi communities in Indonesia. And as I said, Chokro Aminoto's book, Islam and Socialism, which published in 1924, is very heavily drawing on Kidwai's work. In fact, sections of it are copied word for word, large sections of it. So in terms of the 1910s and early 1920s, that is the main connection with India. There are also connections in terms of this example of the Swadeshi movement is being taken up by people within the left of the Syarikat Islam who think that this is a useful example for how to resist colonialism. Tan Malaka is one such person. And there's a hope that India is part of a rising tide of Asian anti-colonialism. And indeed, if the British rule is overthrown in India, it might trigger a sort of domino effect, which brings down European imperialism across Asia. So that is another channel through which Indian ideas are affecting this Islamic socialist discourse in the time that I'm describing.
Okay.
Siavash.
Yeah. So the first question I think was from Juan, if I got that right. Yeah, Abu Zar is a fascinating figure. I'm not a historian. I don't know much about the history of early Islam, and what I know about Abu Zar is, or Abu Dhar, is from what I've read from Shariati and his sources, and it's a fascinating. I mean, the story or the legend at least is fascinating, right? This poor man who lives in poverty, converts to Islam, becomes a disciple of the Prophet, and then after the Prophet's death, sort of leads this one-man revolt against what he sees as the corruption of the caliphate, right, after the Prophet, and is seen as this inspirational figure. So fascinating story and the legend, I think. Now, in terms of the early versions of Islamic socialism and the Jangali movement and the Soviet links there, that's a great question. Well, as I mentioned, I think the links the links between Iran and Russian socialism predate the revolution, the Russian Revolution. As I said, there were significant populations of Iranian migrant workers who were living in the Caucasus, which of course has to be understood in the context of the expansion of global capitalism. I mean, this is the time when a lot of these workers have lost their jobs. They have migrated from central parts of Iran after Iran sort of turns into a cash crop economy. They're migrating up north in search of finding jobs. They're finding jobs in the Caucasus, and there they're exposed to Russian socialist revolutionary discourses. And many of them join the Social Democratic Labor Party in Russia. Many of them become close friends with leading socialists in Russia, including Lenin and Kautsky and others. And they correspond with them even when they go back to Iran. We have these letter correspondences, very interesting, very intriguing, that when the Iranian constitutional revolution is happening, Iranian socialists are writing letters to Kautsky and others and asking them, what do you think we should do? Do you think we should participate in this revolution? Is this a progressive movement? Is this a liberal movement? Should we? I mean, there's all kinds of interesting conversations that are happening. But so the point that I'm trying to make is that we should not see socialism in Iran and the beginning of socialism in Iran as Russian influence, because it predates the Soviet Union. But of course, once the Soviet Union comes around, it becomes a major factor in Iran. Of course, the Jangali movement is which is another Islamic socialist movement, or perhaps an Islamist socialist movement, is happening right around the same time as the creation of the Soviet Union. And there's all kinds of interesting things that are happening. There's the Jangali movement, which is eventually they call themselves the Soviet Republic of Iran. They form a Soviet Republic, an autonomous Soviet Republic in the north of Iran, in the Gilan province. The movement is made up of both religious socialists and secular socialists. There's two currents in the Jangali movement who are running Gilan. It's a coalition of these two forces. And eventually, once the Soviet Union comes to power, and after Iranian central government signs a peace agreement or some kind of a treaty with the Soviet Union withdraws its support for the Gilan Soviet Republic. And when it does that, the secular socialists, the Marxist socialists, they leave Gilan. And it's the leader of the movement, Mirza Kuchek Khan, who's a Muslim socialist, he's sort of left alone. And he's eventually hunted down by the Iranian soldiers, and the movement is suppressed. So many Iranian socialists blame the collapse of the Iranian Soviet Republic on Soviet Union's accommodationist approach toward the Iranian central government. Instead of supporting their Soviet allies, they supported the Iranian central government. So there's a lot of that happening. And then to the question quickly on what was the other question on Khomeini. And if I understood this question correctly, something about Khomeini's Shi'i-centrism and how that plays into his view on historical materialism. I think Khomeini is Shi'i-centric, of course. I mean, that's the whole theory of Velayat al-Faqih comes out of this, interpretation of Shi'i doctrines. But let me say something about historical materialism. I haven't come across anything in Khomeini's own text engaging directly with historical materialism or dialectical materialism. But this is an important task among within the Islamist movement. In fact, in the 1940s, we have the first text in Iran written by a Marxist named Taqi Irani, who publishes a magazine called Dunya, and he writes a series of articles in Dunya magazine introducing dialectical materialism to Iran. Now, the reason he does this is because at the time, there is a law in Iran called the law against collective ideology, which is basically a ban on communism. So you can't say Marxist newspapers, you can't say communism newspapers, but nobody really knows what dialectical materialism means. So he uses this language of dialectical materialism to introduce Marxism in Iran. Almost a decade after Irani writes his articles introducing dialectical materialism in Iran, we have an Islamist or a major Shi'i cleric, Allama Tabatabai, who writes a critique of dialectical materialism. And then some decades later, Ayatollah Murtaza Motahari, who is a student of Allama Tabatabai, he writes another critique of dialectical materialism or historical materialism. So the short answer is, as far as I know, Khomeini himself does not engage with the question, but Khomeini's very close disciple, Ayatollah Motahari, has written extensively about a critique of historical materialism from a particularly Islamic perspective. I don't know if it's from a Shi'i perspective. I would say it's from a broadly Islamic perspective.
Great, thank you for your engaging answers. So we are slowly coming to an end. We have a last round of questions, two questions, one by Johan Čeko, who had a follow-up, and then Layli will have the final word. And I'm just reading out Johan Čeko's question. Give me 1 second. So this is directed to Siavash. Oliver hinted at the role of class structure in ideological differences, for example, over business ownership. So does class structure map onto or explain how your typology works? Was this question clear? Yeah. Okay, Layli, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes. So again, I have one each for Oliver and Siavash. So Oliver, as a historian, I'm always curious as to what other people's archives look like, particularly because I'm working on a figure and I'm working on sort of a constituency where there, where writing is not the primary mode of communication or text. So it's really a question of where are your archives, but also in terms of, you know, when we're thinking about Indonesia, a lot of it is around the political history of Islamic socialism or sort of communism. And I'm just wondering what a cultural history of Islamic socialism looks like in Indonesia. What is the poetry that's coming out of, that's being produced by Islamic socialists? What are the fiction, or what are the stories? What are the songs? What are the picture artwork that's being produced by Islamic socialists in Indonesia? If you could answer to that, that would be great. Siavash, I mean, it's, you know, you started off, and this is something, as someone who, you know, is really interested in this idea of Islamic socialism as a politics of anti-colonialism, as a politics of resistance, as well. I'm wondering if it, you know, if it offers a language or a vocabulary for thinking of the present, right? Is it useful anymore to think of it as, you know, of Islamic socialism, or should we be thinking of something other than Islamic socialism? Those are the two questions.
I'll go first. Well, yes, thanks. It's a really central question in terms of what we do. You know, what material we're really drawing on to make these arguments. My main archives are pamphlets and newspapers. There's a very lively press in Indonesia in this period, both in Dutch and in vernacular languages. There's an easing of press censorship at the start of the 20th century, which contributes to this, and a proliferation of newspapers, printing presses. Also, you know, a growing public that demands these things, an increasingly literate public. But as you say, this raises the question of non-written communication, given that most of the Indonesian population at this time is not literate. And if they are literate, they may be not literate in Dutch or in Malay, which are the two main media through which these arguments are conveyed. Although there are, you know, newspapers in say, Javanese. And I suppose it's two ways of addressing that. One is that newspapers are read aloud, and, you know, there's evidence for this. So we should think of them not just as sources that educated elites have access to, but which are reaching wider audiences. The other is that speeches are being made. I mean, I quoted from some of these speeches being made at Syarikat Islam conferences, which are then, you know, recorded either by the Dutch or by the organizations themselves. So they're reaching a larger audience in that sense. And yes, I suppose, you know, an interesting question is whether Islamic socialism in the verbal media is different from in the written media, right? So I think it may well be the case that when these people are writing essays, they're much more likely to draw on, I'm talking about people within the left Syarikat Islam, more likely to draw on Marx and Engels and so on. But when they're making their speeches, they perhaps are more likely to draw on vernacular or Islamic examples. So this idea of Ratu Adil, the just king in Java, this is a feature of speeches, but I don't find it much in written media. And sort of following on from that is this question of other forms of literary production or visual production, poetry, fiction, songs, and artworks that can potentially reach different audiences or different ways of expressing these ideas. Yes, I mean, there is some research on this. Keith Fulcher has written a little bit about leftist novels in the 1920s. And in fact, Hong Chuan, in some of his research, has discussed cartoons in the newspapers of the left Syarikat Islam and the Indonesian Communist Party and other political organizations. I would just mention one work that I've written about a little, which is Semaun, the trade unionist, Syarikat Islam leader, communist that I mentioned. He writes a novel called Hikayat Kadirun in 1920, the story of Kadirun. And this, I think, is interesting again, because whereas in his writings in Dutch or in the communist press, he's talking about Marx and Engels and the European socialist tradition. In his novel, he doesn't really talk about any of that. He doesn't even use the words class or proletariat or bourgeoisie at all, but it's a kind of parable about what capitalism is doing to the Javanese economy. And it's about this figure Kadirun, who over time is converted to socialism after seeing the effects of capitalism on village life in Indonesia. But yes, I think absolutely there's more work to do in terms of these sources, not least because they tend to be written by people who are less educated in the Western style. And also they're trying to communicate ideas in less of a European idiom. So in that sense, there's a more thoroughgoing translation into vernacular idioms than is the case in these well, very much than in the Dutch media, which are situating themselves in a different kind of linguistic but also intellectual setting. But yes, no, it's definitely something that I want to pursue more. And just to make one last point, Tan Malaka, who I've been mentioning frequently, there are novels written about him in the 1930s by a journalist in Sumatra called Hasbullah Parindurung, better known by his pen name Matumona. And in these novels, Tan Malaka is turned into an Islamic fighter, right? He travels to Mecca, he wages jihad against the British in Palestine. But the real Tan Malaka never did this. He never went to the Holy Land. He went to Moscow and he worked for the Comintern, for the Communist International. But when he's, in a sense, Indonesianized, vernacularized in these novels, he's turned into a very pious Muslim. So I think, yes, there's more scope for this in terms of how socialism or Islamic socialism is understood at one remove, right? How the reception of these figures and ideas happens in this more popular vernacular media.
Great.
Okay, so Johan, thank you for that question. Great question. My simple answer is no. The categories that I came up with for this presentation, or not for this presentation, but for the categories that I'm working with right now, I haven't really taken class into account. And of course, this is a weakness, and I'm really glad you brought that up. I'm gonna work on that in my future work. What I can say very quickly for now is that if we think of these two orientations, these two broad orientations, religious socialism and secular socialism, I would say that both of them have when we look at the intellectuals, the membership within the parties, both of these groups have mostly a middle class, urban middle class class space. I would say that the religious left, Islamists and Islamic socialists, quite often come from families and that we would consider traditional bourgeoisie, with closer links to the bazaar, for example. Whereas when we're talking about secular socialists, whether we're talking about Fadai guerrillas or Tude, they more or less represent the modern bourgeoisie. And so there is that difference. And in fact, Bijane Jazani, one of the leaders of Fadai guerrillas, in one of the critiques that he wrote about Islamic socialism or Islamic Marxism, he argued that people like Shariati and Mujahideen ultimately will benefit Khomeini because even though their discourses are different, ultimately they come from the same class background. They both come from the traditional bourgeoisie. And if there is a revolution, and if people like Shariati and Mujahideen play a role in this revolution, after the revolution, the clerics will take the lead because the clerics are much better positioned within their class, within the traditional bourgeoisie than these intellectuals like Shariati or Mujahideen. So I think there's a lot to be done, and I'm really, I appreciate that you brought this up and gave me some ideas to work with. And Layli, with your question on Islamic socialism, is there any utility to it today? If I understood you sort of correctly, I don't know. I mean, I go back and forth in my recent work. I go back and forth dealing with, sometimes I'm trying to work with the category of Islamic socialism, and then sometimes I find myself more interested in the category of Islamic liberation theology, and more recently in the category of Islamic intersectional liberation theology. And because you're asking me today, and today I'm much more interested in liberation theology and intersectional liberation theology, simply because I think it has a more serious critical engagement with the Islamic tradition. And it takes the task of critiquing history and critiquing tradition more seriously than Islamic socialism, which sometimes tends to be a little more ambivalent about dealing with critically with Islamic history, with fiqh, with those traditions. Now, there's the other thing too, that I would say in contemporary Iran, and this is maybe particular to Iran, because of the experience of the 1979 revolution, and because of the experience of 4 decades of the Islamic Republic, the very label Islamic draws a lot of skepticism, and specifically among the secular left. For the secular left, the label Islamic socialist, Islamic nationalist, Islamic anything, triggers the trauma of the 1980s and the trauma of the past 4 decades. So in some ways, there might be some resistance to the label Islamic socialism. That being said, my general take is that as long as there is socialism, as long as socialism is an alternative to the status quo and an alternative for a better possible world, and as long as there are Muslims, there's going to be Islamic socialism or some variation of Islamic Muslim socialism. That's not going to go away. The question becomes, how do we negotiate these very these tricky grounds of dealing with the trauma of the Islamic Republic, while recognizing that there are many Iranians and many people all across Islamic contexts who are still who have faith and the people of faith and take their religious traditions seriously, and some of them might be capitalists and some of them might not be capitalists. How do we negotiate these social divides? And I don't have a good answer for that.
Thank you. Thank you to Siavash and Oliver for 2 very wonderful presentations, and to the audience for their questions and for joining us. We're back here again tomorrow, but at 2 p.m. British Summer Time, and the conversation will turn to Egypt and Bangladesh. The speakers will be Manfred Singh, who's a senior researcher at Leibniz Institute of European History, and Abunti Haroon, who's an assistant professor at the University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh. And so we'll see you again, hopefully tomorrow and the day after. But yeah, once again, thank you very much.